I am Marie Helburg Callahan Brugger, now Brugger. And I've been a resident of Louisville all my life, been a native, born and raised here back in 1911. And I am the only remaining child in my family at the present time. The rest have all passed on. There were 2 boys and 3 girls in the family. My father, Victor Helburg, was killed while serving on duty in Louisville back in 1915. The exact date was October the 28th, 1915.
You says your dad was on duty, Marie?
Yes.
What kind of a duty was he doing in the city of Louisville?
And he served the City of Louisville, Justice of the Peace, Town Clerk, and Assistant Marshal. I was 4 and a half at the time of my dad's death. And at that particular day, he was to go out to the city reservoir and check out there, which was another one of the marshal's duties. And later in the afternoon, we were informed that Dad had met his untimely death. At that time, there was a gentleman by the name of Frank Ballister who lived in the community and had a small fruit and vegetable market.
He lived here in Louisville?
Right, known at that time as Front Street, which was approximately across from Steinbaugh's lumber yard. And he handled and sold fruits and vegetables. There was an ordinance that had been placed on the city before the city council and had been passed that all people who sold or distributed goods for sale in the community had to obtain a license for that purpose. And during those days, also another ordinance that was on the city records consisted of the people who had wares to sell of any kind, which at that time they sold clothing, they sold cooking utensils, they sold fruit and vegetables and household wares and supplies of many, many varied types. And these vendors took them throughout the community in their wagons, within the wagons and horses, and they went usually up and down the alleys and hollering the wares that they had to sell. Well, there were many complaints from women who had children and babies who took naps in the afternoons. There was no way of segregating that noise in any manner, so they just hollered the wares that they had to sell going up and down the alleys. And many complaints had come into City Hall stating that it was creating a nuisance. So they asked the city to create an ordinance for the purpose of asking these people not to holler out the wares that they had to sell, which was disturbing people who had children napping. And it was passed by the city ordinance, by the city council, the ordinance was. And then this Mr. Ballister, everybody in the community knew him quite well. We had been informed that he had come to Louisville from Italy after killing a man over there, and he had fled to Louisville. But Whether that was correct or incorrect, we do not know, but that is anyway what we were informed of.
Pardon me, that was Sicily that he come from.
Sicily, yes. Sicily was his birthplace, I imagine. And so Mr. Ballister, insisted on continuing to call out the wares that he had to sell. So there were more complaints had come into City Hall here, and stating that they wished that could be curbed in some manner. So it was my dad's duty to ask him to not do that. And he said, I paid for my license, and I will do it wherever and whenever I want to. And so Dad said, well, Frank, it is against the law. There's an ordinance stating that you cannot do that, and we just cannot have it go on. So he said, I've warned you a couple of times to that effect. And he said, since the people are complaining so much about it, that we're going to have to ask you definitely to stop that, or I will have to take you in. And Dad walked away. Now this occurred right down here, 1 block south, at the exact corner on Pine and Main. And at that time there was the old commercial hotel, which was situated right about in the middle of the block, and had a great large screen porch situated in the building and it faced north, and that was for their residents at the hotel to sit on summer days when it was hot and warm. And there were several people sitting on the porch at that particular time. And so as Dad was walking east towards Main Street, why, Mr. Ballister was facing east also in his horse and buggy. And Dad was walking east, and he took out a .30-30 rifle and blew the top of my dad's head right off. And
Marie, can I intercede here just a minute?
certainly,
You said that he had purchased the license.
he had his license.
He did have his license.
There was a license that all vendors had to
Well,
have.
there was a
Conflicts.
conflicting story, because we've heard the story, but the story was that he had not purchased the license, and your dad was after him because of that. But this is wrong. It was after him because of the noise. He had purchased the license, but he was after him to stop the noise.
That is my understanding.
Okay.
He said, I have my license and I will holler whenever and wherever I want to. Now, of course, I was only 4 1/2 at the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is hearsay to me, but I believe that the family would have
I do, yeah.
more
Yes.
of a
This is why I
real
wanted
knowledge
this
of it than,
corrected. Yeah.
That's right.
than
That's have to be
anyone else.
corrected. Yes.
And he got out of town in this horse and wagon out south of town. And he changed horses out there and got into Denver. And there was a posse formed immediately. It was witnessed by these people sitting on the commercial hotel porch. And they found the horses south of town, about 2 miles south. And the horses were frothy and exhausted from him running them at the rate of speed. And it was a hot fall day. And he got into Denver at that time from here. Okay, there was a reward placed upon him by the City of Louisville. And he, at that time, particular time, there was the Black Hand, or called Mafia in later days, and which this undoubtedly had perhaps some connection, I don't know. But he would be seen on one side of the street on occasions, and occasionally on the opposite side of the street.
This was in Denver.
This was in Denver, and there were underground tunnels that this was possible to go from one side of the street to the other through those tunnels. And I think the police were on the lookout for him. And he left Denver, to the best of our knowledge, out of the Union Station in Denver, dressed as a woman. Now that, to our knowledge, my family's knowledge, was the last that we had heard about this until the Boulder Daily Camera came out with a caption on July the 6th, 1966. This happened in 1915. The Boulder Daily Camera come out with a caption in July 1966, where it said, "Killer of Louisville man located after 50 years." The caption says as follows: "A Boulder County murder case is being aired this week, cautiously and carefully, by Sheriff Arthur Everson. The murder victim has been dead for 50 years, and the accused killer is reportedly 97 years old." The long-forgotten slaying sent officials to the county record suddenly Tuesday, when the sheriff's office received a telephone from Douglas, Arizona. The caller, who identified himself as Wilkie Holland Ferris, said he had located Frank Ballister, who on October the 28th, 1915, shot and killed Victor Helburg, assistant town marshal at Louisville in southeast Boulder County.
My father saying that he went back to Sicily and he was convicted of the crime that he had committed there.
Oh.
Now that is all my dad ever said. And my dad knew your dad well.
The only thing that I would say there is that Everson had checked back in Mexico to find out if the call that had come in was authentic. And they said definitely that it was. And asked us if we wanted to pursue the thing. And we said absolutely not, that there was only Francis and Dorothy and me left. And the man was 97 years old. And if he said that he was ready to confess, why, if he had had it on his conscience all these years, there was no reason whatsoever for us to pursue it, whatsoever. And after this time, if he was 97 then, and that was in 66, this is 11 years later, why, he is gone.
Gone, yeah.
But Everson said, all that we wanted to know, if the call was authentic. And he said absolutely. And asked us if we cared to pursue it. And we said definitely not. Mom was gone, Will was gone, Vic was gone.
That's right.
Well, 97, what would they do anyway?
Yes.
Yes. No.
Marie, let's go over to, and let Lena introduce herself, and then we'll come back to that in a minute.
Mm-hmm.
Go ahead, Lena.
Now,
Your name.
Your name and your maiden name, and
my maiden name was Lena Romano. And my parents immigrated here from Italy. But they didn't come here. They went to the southern part of the state in Florence, Colorado. And both my sisters then moved to Idaho in Pocatello. And there, both my sisters, Mary and Jenny, were born in Pocatello, Idaho. Then he wanted to come up to this part of the country, and he went to Florence, and from Florence he came into Louisville. No, to Denver. I was born in Denver in November the 1st, 1899. Then we moved to Louisville because there was a lot of coal mines, and Dad wanted to work in the coal mines, and I was 6 months old when we moved here, Louisville. We lived in a little house here on right next to Moffat's.
What part of the town would that be in, Lena?
Well,
on Main
Main
Street?
Street?
on Main Street. On Main Street.
That's right.
Then Dad bought a home up on Jefferson, there, right next to where Alberta Parks used to live, close to the church there. And then he finally sold it and bought the acreage where we are still living on.
What is the address there, Lena?
533 East Street. And I've lived there ever since. Then I married, and I was married to Martin Polluconi, who was killed in a mine accident in 1929
Tell us a little bit about the mine accident.
What mine was
at
it?
the Matchless Mine. And the Domenico brothers were running the mine at that time. He lived 2.5 days, and I was left with 3 boys, and one had preceded us in death.
Lena, let's back up a minute. What kind of an accident was your husband killed in?
Cave-in.
A cave-in.
A cave-in. And he was just crushed. And so I was left with the 3 children, and my middle son, Arthur Polluconi, passed away in 1927, 18 months before his dad passed away in that accident. So I was left with the 3 boys. The oldest boy, Abel, was not quite 12, and Florian was 5 years younger, and I was left with Ronald, 9 months old.
Lena, did you get any compensation?
Yes, I got
from the
state
miners?
compensation of $54 a month. So my mother and dad moved in with me, and it was a blessing to me to have them there, because I went out and done different work, and I knew that the children were taken care of.
What kind of work did you do?
Housework. And then, when Ronald was 6 years old, I remarried, and I married George Ingram. And he passed away January the 14th, 1971. And I have been alone since then.
And tell us what your children are doing now.
Well, my oldest son, Abel, is living in Tucson, and he is chief in the Tucson Hospital, and he is chief of the administration office. And he is married and has, his wife's name is Virginia, and they have 2 children, a boy named Martin after his granddad, and a daughter, Lisa Ann. Then my son Florian is living in Longmont, and he has been on construction work. And he has a daughter, Sandra, living in New Orleans, and she has a son. Her name is Sandra Janes, and she has a son, 3 or 4 years old. He'll be 4. And my son Ronald lives in Boulder, and he had 2 children. Flash had, well, that's the oldest girl, Sandra, and then he had Edward and Paula. Paula is going to be a high school graduate at the end of this year, and she has been working at IBM. And his son Edward is married and has a little girl named Heather Ann, and they are living in Berthoud.
Lena, tell us something about the city of Louisville, how it looked to you in those years, and what kind of a construction in the city that they had, buildings and so forth. Tell us some of that if you can remember, and something about the strike.
Well, could I tell you about my son Ronald first?
Yes.
Now, he is living in Boulder. He's married, and he has 2 children. 2. Well, they are both grown up. There's Ronald. He's married and living in Niawat. And Kathy is living in Denver and living alone. And he is one of the owners of the JLTV television repair. There's 3 owners, he and 2 others. Well, when what I can say about the town of Louisville, it was very small, and when we came here, and a lot of mines, a lot of beer saloons, and there was a lot of conflicts. The strikes they had, which were very dangerous, and my dad participated because he was a very strong union man, and he believed in the union. And they had the big strike where the bullets were whizzing over our house all the time, from the Hecla, the Brooks, the Vulcan mine. Of course, the Acme didn't do much. They were pretty, but all these other mines were very, contradictory. They just brought in the militia, and the militia was for the non-union men. Then they brought in the federal troops, and they really brought order back to the town. But when the militia come in, we lived right across the tracks there, and my dad went up on the tracks there, and this General Chase that come in with the militia just shoved him back off of the tracks, you know. And then there was some of our union men were under the trestle, but they got caught by the militia because the train stopped, and they caught them. I don't know what they were going to do, because my dad sent my mother and myself and my sister Jenny and Mary's daughter Helen to Denver to stay with friends. He didn't want us there, at home here, because he said it was too dangerous. So then, when the federal men come in, they were very peaceful. It settled. Then after that, they had a wobbly strike, which didn't last very long. You know, they just went out on strike and the Wobblies come in, but it didn't last to amount to anything.
Lena, may I ask, did you get any food or anything during the strike that the men, when the time that the men were not working?
I can't remember that. I don't remember if they did. See, that strike lasted a long time.
Yes.
It lasted about 5 years.
That's right.
How did you live at that time with no income?
Well, my parents were thrifty, and they raised a big garden every year, and we had about let's see, there was about 7.5 acres there. Dad raised corn, and he had corn, beans, and the garbanzo beans, and we had a cow and a horse, and we raised hogs. So we didn't suffer too much that way, because he also raised wheat and alfalfa, and the wheat he sold and kept enough, you know, for what he needed. And so we didn't have really a hard time, you know, food-wise. But I know a lot of people that did.
Marie, just to intercede on that, when your father was killed, how were you compensated?
Nothing,
Nothing from the city at all?
nothing whatsoever, no.
So how did your family survive?
My mother took in sewing, washing, and all kinds of laundry, sewing, washing, ironing, sewing. And of course, my brothers were growing up slightly, and they had to take over.
When Lena brought out that point, I was wondering.
That's the way we just got along the best way we knew how. Just like all of the other widows in town, through the mine accidents and things of that nature. And I was 4.5. I went to school, put me in school.
At 4.5?
At 4.5, I went over to school. But I wasn't, that is just merely to get me out of the way at home.
What school did you go to?
Catholic school, right across the street. No, Father had come over and he said, we'll put her in school to get her out of the way at home. Dorothy was 25 months old, and all I did was sit there. See, my mother after that had a nervous breakdown, and she was hospitalized for quite a long time, quite a period of time.
And did the city of Louisville pay for her bills at least?
No, nothing, absolutely nothing. They, well, when my dad worked for the city at that time, his wages were $100 per month, and there were 7 of us. Now, of course, at that time, $1 would buy a sack of flour or a sack of sugar. But those were the wages. And then, of course, he was practically on duty 24 hours a day, for the simple reason that when there were unruly circumstances at night with all of the saloons here in town, why they had to have help. So many nights, many days, he worked 24 hours a day.
Lena, when you went out to do housework, when your children were small, what were your wages? What did people pay you to do?
40 cents an hour.
40 cents an hour? And what did you do? Did you do their washing or just?
No, I didn't do the washing. I done the house cleaning. And I worked for various people here in town. Then it went up to 50 cents an hour. I helped them with all their house cleaning at house cleaning time. Washed walls and all that sort of work that goes with general house cleaning.
Lena, did the people have facilities in their home at that time?
Yes, they did. They did. They had all the facilities, the sweepers and, all that.
Indoor toilet and everything?
Yes, yes.
In other words, you worked for probably the more prominent people in town.
Yes.
who could afford that sort of thing.
Yes, that's right. I don't have to mention names.
No, we don't want
No, we
to.
don't want no names, no.
Well, Marie, when your mother did the, took in ironing and so forth, do you have any idea what she was paid?
No, I wouldn't, because I was only 4.5. My dad was in business in a meat market, ran and owned and operated a meat market in Denver. And of course,
In what year, Marie?
it would possibly be in the 1896, 98, or along and through that period of time. And he went broke with the hundreds of other businesses that had to close shop. And he came to Louisville. And after that, marrying my mother. And he had fully intended to open and operate a meat market here. But there were a couple of other markets here. And so he stated that he didn't want to go into business in opposition to them. So one of the markets at that time, I think, was Mr. Thurloway, Robert Thurloway's market. And they had told Dad if he didn't care to go into business then, that they wished that he would attempt to apply for the marshal job. And that is how he happened to take up that job. And incidentally, my brother Will, who was killed on Labor Day in 1920 in this interurban wreck, he came dashing home right about noontime. My mother was canning pickles, and he said, "Mom," he said, "this is the last ball game of the season. I think I'll go to Denver and witness the ball game." She said, "Well, you're going to have to hurry. It's pretty close to 11 o'clock for that train to come through." He said, "Oh, I'll make it. I'll make it." He ran on down to the depot down here, and he got the last seat that was vacant on the train.
That was in Durban, wasn't it?
In Urban. And the Thurloway girl got on just minutes after he did and was coming through. So he gave up his seat to give to her so she would have a place to sit. And he went into the smoker of the car, which is the front portion. And that was where he was killed. That's the part that was hit head on. And of course there were several others here in town that were killed. There was a Carveth. There was Zarina. And my brother. And I think there were others that I can't call to memory.
There were 5, weren't there?
No, I think there were 5.
Nine. Nine, I think he said.
Well, there were others. And then he was killed back in 1920, and he was 22 years old. So he was 17 with the burden of raising the family, caring for the family when Dad was killed. He was 17.
Jenny, Lena, do you remember anything about the bad flu that we had here?
Oh, yes. When so many people died?
Yes.
Yes, I do remember, because my son Abel was just a baby. And my husband, Martin, didn't want me to take him anywhere because the flu was so bad. And there was the Ledwig girl, not Maud, but yes, Maud Ledwig. She was married to the attorney. I can't remember his name. They both passed away with the flu. And there was so many You know where Jenkins used to live? They made that into a small hospital. And they took all the patients there. But we lost so many here in town with that flu.
That was Ludwig.
Ludwig, Maud Ludwig, and her husband, I can't remember his name, but he was an attorney. And I think she was expected.
Did local people work in that hospital, or did they get nurses from
Well, I
outside?
think they had some assistance from Boulder. And a lot of people were fortunate it never hit at all. And a lot of them really had a hard time with it. It lasted for quite a while.
You didn't tell us if you were able to go to school, Lena. Did you go to school?
Oh yes, I went to the Catholic school and I graduated from the 8th grade, and then I went to the high school and I quit in the 11th grade. I never finished, to the 12th.
Do you remember anything about the flu, Lena?
Yes, I do. I recall that I was a small child at the time, but we had a neighbor who had come in from the Trinidad-Walsenburg area and moved in next door to us, and I was over there, and while they were in the southern coalfield area there, they had had black diphtheria. So I went to their home and I got it. And I was the only one in town that had it. And the doctor came and he said, oh, there's just nothing that I can do for that child. He said, we're having to try to cope with this flu situation, and he said, they're just dying just like flies. And he said, I won't. There's nothing I can do for her. He said, I won't be back. And so then we went next door and got Father Cyril. Father Cyril was a gentleman who had the long beard, and the why he wore this long beard mainly was to disguise the big goiter that he had underneath. And he made the boys go out into the country and get wild hay. And he came 3 times a day to the house, morning, noon, and night. And he would, I don't know what it was that he burned on a little tiny coal scuttle and made me inhale the fumes under a tent made out of a sheet so that I could inhale those fumes. And with the wild hay, they put it into the great big old wash tubs that we had and poured boiling water over it and did the same thing. You had to inhale the steam of that the smell of that wild hay. And I was the only one in town who had it, and it never went any further. That is, nobody else got it from me or anything like that. But it was through the assistance of Father Cyril that took care of me. Saved my life, in fact.
He used to go all over to the different parishioners and give them medication from herbs and
Things of that
stuff
nature.
like
Yes,
that.
he would, the boys would go out with him and they'd dig roots and herbs and gather all of that stuff. And he used to make quite a study of it and went all around the community and
Was
helped.
this black diphtheria considered a deadly disease at the time?
Oh,
Yes,
definitely.
Definitely. Mhm.
There was, there were 2 or 3 forms, maybe more, of diphtheria that I'm aware of. But I had both the black diphtheria and the other. But this was the black diphtheria, yes. That's, in that capacity, I know about the flu.
Do you remember anything about the big fire that we had on Main Street?
And the bank robbery. There was a bank robbery on Main Street here at one time.
Oh, yes,
Would you please tell us about that, too?
Lena, can you recall anything?
Well, about the bank robbery, I remember that they went in and they locked, I think it was Ann Little, wasn't it? Ann Little, and who else?
The curtain boy.
The curtain, in the vault,
Jack.
Jack Curtin.
They didn't lock it.
They didn't lock it, but
They didn't lock it. They closed the door. And she said, "Oh, please don't lock the door because there isn't any means of air in here." So he did not lock it. He didn't lock the door. But he just closed it and told them to lie down on the floor.
Yes. I remember that. And then I remember the fire that was the Mangus store that was on the corner.
Mhm.
And, well, wasn't the bank involved in it too? The bank?
It was right next to
Yes.
us.
Right next door there. And there was another building.
That was, I believe, I'm not sure who owned it, but I'm kind
Corona's garage.
the garage there, yes.
The garage.
The garage.
Yes, because that was left vacant for a long time.
And the telephone office.
Office. That's right.
Those 4 buildings.
That was quite a fire.
Indeed it was.
This is one thing that's never come up, and I was thinking about it the other day. How did you bathe in those days? You didn't have any indoor facilities.
No.
Wash tub,
In the wash tub.
Number 3.
big number
big
3.
number
Big
three.
number 3. One leg in and one leg
Galvanized
out.
wash tub. And you heated your water with a 5-gallon copper boiler if you could afford
No.
a copper boiler,
They-
or the reservoir on a coal stove at the back end. And you changed water all the time because 5 in a family bathe in the same water.
That's what I was trying to
That's
get at.
right.
Did you all take baths in the same water?
No.
Oh.
No, because we never did. Mother heated a great big copper boiler. She
Oh.
had one.
Wash clothes boiler.
Uh-huh. And she'd, each one, she'd half of that boiling hot water and half cold. And we each had our baths
And how often did you do this?
once a week.
Once a week.
In those days, it was once a week.
Once a week.
And we never had electricity down there. We burned coal oil lamps. And I still have my coal oil lamps. Then they decided to bring the electricity down there. And everybody thought we were living, across the tracks. Uncivilized, Well, everybody had outhouses in those days. Quite a few of them did. They didn't all have bathtubs and everything. So we got the electricity, and it was a joy because it was so wonderful to have the lights.
When was?
We thought we
what
had
year was
everything
it?
when we had electricity. Our
So-
world was almost complete with electricity, really and truly.
About what year was this? Do you have any idea?
The little boy I lost in 1927 was about 3.5 years old. So when they brought the electricity down.
Now, that was after they had it right within the city limits, right?
We could have possibly had it a little bit sooner, because Will had Mr. Vernarsdale wire the house, and Will was killed in 20. So we had it just a few years previously.
Yeah.
Did you, Marie, you didn't tell us about your family's baths.
We had the old copper boiler that we put on the stove, and that was on Saturday it was for bath water, and on Monday it was for boiling clothes. And in addition, with that boiler, we had the tank on the back of the stove that we heated the water. And
A reservoir.
we figured the reservoir on the back of the coal stove, definitely.
Hold on
And-
just a second, I have to turn the tape over.